Yeah, I think we are ready to start and let participants enter the Zoom room. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you and maybe good morning to the people who are joining from the other side of the world. I welcome you all to this very special, I think, webinar. I call it a policy discussion webinar where, in fact, two renowned experts will be in conversation on policy issues like privatization, cryptocurrencies, SPACs, and many more. I welcome both the distinguished panelists. In particular, I welcome Professor SP to the Mishra Center for Financial Markets and Economy at IIMA. I am Abhiman, a professor in the economics area of IIMA and also currently the chairing the activity of the Mishra Center. This center actually undertakes applied policy-oriented research at the intersection of financial markets and economy, which encompasses various issues like market structure, regulation, central bank policy, real estate, accounting, financing, banking, bond market, even financial inclusions, to enumerate a few. We also facilitate wider scope for research by faculty and the doctoral students working in these fields. We are also engaged with relevant stakeholders who influence policies as well as those who are significantly influenced by these policies. We also have a vibrant policy forum where we discuss current policy issues. Today, we are actually into one of those policy forums. Now, let me introduce two distinguished experts for today's policy panel. Professor SP Kothari, known as SP, he is a recent Padma Shri awardee, I think one of the very few from IIMA. He is currently the Gordon Y. Billiard Professor of Accounting and Finance at MIT Sloan School of Management. He holds a PhD from University of Iowa, MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, BS in Engineering from BITS Pilani. Professor Kothari has at a very senior executive level experience in government, academia, industry, with expertise in strategy and policy issues, securities regulation, auditing, and corporate governance. Most recently, he served as a chief economist and director of the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis at the US Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, from 2019 to 2021. Many of you have seen him as the editor of one of the FT50 journal, a Journal of Accounting and Economics, for many years, maybe over a decade. Welcome, Professor SP, for this policy discussion today. And he joining with his classmate at IIMA, Professor J.R. Verma. He is a professor of finance and accounting at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, where he teaches many courses, among them which are quite famous or popular to the students are in capital market, fixed income, alternative investment, risk management, corporate finance. Professor Verma has been teaching a course also on blockchain, cryptocurrencies for quite some time. He is currently an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India. I think one of the most, I should not call this as a hot seat, but at least I consider this as a judgment seat of Vikramaditya, where he has to take a call every 2 months. He has been a full-time member of the Securities and Exchange Board in India. And before that, he was also a part-time member of SEBI. He has been the chairman of Secondary Markets Advisory Committee and several other committees of SEBI. He has also been the chairman of several other committees set up by Forward Markets Commission and Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Professor Verma was a member of the Raghuram Rajan Committee on Financial Sector Reforms and of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission. With this brief introduction, I hand it over to Professor Verma to take it over for the webinar discussion today. Please take liberty of structuring the discussion as you feel appropriate and interesting. Participants are encouraged to post their questions in the chat box. I will pick them up suitably during the course of the discussion. Over to you, Professor Verma.
Thank you, Abhiman. And let me add my own word of welcome to all the participants, and welcome to SP for taking the time to join us today. As you would know from the title, we are basically discussing three topics. We'll be discussing privatization, we will be discussing cryptocurrencies, and we will be discussing SPACs, which are the new way of going public. Very roughly, we will devote roughly equal time to each of these, maybe a little more for some of them, a little less, but roughly, let's say half an hour each on each of this and review. And at the end of each of this, I would take questions from the audience on that subject. So we will begin with privatization. After some round of discussion between us and hearing what SP has to say, I will take questions from you on privatization. Then we will move to crypto. We'll have a discussion on crypto, and then I'll take questions from there. And then finally, we will come to SPACs. That's broadly the way we are discussing this, because if you push all the questions to the end, with intervening topics, the entire thread would be lost. So let's begin with privatization. SP, that this government has, for the first time, actually been willing to utter that word, which was hitherto regarded as taboo. Okay, so until now, you could call it divestment, you could call it bringing in more private sector participation, but you could never really say that we are privatizing. This government is openly doing that, and it has also laid out a very clear roadmap. It says that in sectors which are not strategic, we should be ready to sell everything. And in sectors which we regard as strategic, we should probably have, one or two public sector champions, and we should sell the rest. So even sectors which earlier would have been regarded as sacred cows, the new policy says, yes, we must have a national champion, maybe two of them, but the rest of it should all go private. And that raises a lot of questions. Questions about how will this actually happen? Where would the money come for this? Who would be willing to put in the capital? How will the newly privatized entity be managed? What are the governance issues that could arise? What are the transition issues that could arise, and so on? And I think SP has a lot of views on this. I would also particularly like SP to spend some time on the very difficult issues in banking, where world over there are concerns about who can own a bank and so on. So how do we privatize half of India's banking system if it comes to that? How will this whole thing work? How should the government approach this, and so on? Over to SP.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Abhiman and Jayant, of course. What a delight it is to be with Jayant after decades. We were classmates together. And earlier I was saying he is one of the smartest people that I have ever known. So it's a privilege to be with both of you and the audience, of course. Thank you. Certainly, we are kicking off with kind of an explosive topic, right? Privatization. It needn't be that way. I mean, so Jan said that, well, this is the sacred cows that are, cows may not be on the chopping block, but sacred cows in India are on the chopping block, I suppose. So, that's the irony. Anyway, I think, first is, does it make sense, privatization? And I might be stating the obvious that efficiency is the main reason why privatization is thought of, that ownership in the private hands is more efficient than in government hands. That's at least the argument. And is there any evidence of that? That is the second thing. And all I can say is there's not a single economically advanced nation that has, for example, financial services in the hands of the government. There simply isn't all over the world. So if we want to be an advanced nation, it seems like that sooner or later we will have to have the financial services sector in the hands of private sector. So many arguments can be made as to why privatization might be good. And there has been long-standing aspiration. And as Jan says, the Modi government is willing to at least take the bull by the horn and do something about it. Now, the real challenge is how to do it, I think. And Jan, you laid out a number of different questions, if you will. And to me, one thing I would say is I think we analyzed a bit too much. Okay, it's simpler than what it seems. So I think there are three challenges. Okay, there are three challenges. One is how to overcome employee resistance, because they are the ones who say that, well, because they see that privatization would sacrifice their lifelong employment, and that's why they tend to resist, or compensation, whatever it is, but that there is resistance there. Second is pricing. How do we price these entities? And third is who will own it, and governance, or who will manage it, right? So I think the second and third, pricing and who will own and who will manage it, are easier to deal with. Okay. First of all, and the first one, the overcoming employee resistance. So let me take all three. The most important, how to overcome employee resistance. Well, I think we can reduce the resistance by giving maybe 20, 30, or 40% of equity to employees. Okay. Just grant it. Because whether they deserve it or not, these are issues of analysis and fairness. I don't think those are relevant here, simply because if you don't sweeten the pot, the deal won't go through. That is the price that you might have to pay, and acknowledge that and move forward with it. Okay. So that will at least make it less likely that they will resist it. And second, more importantly, I think we would have employees as a stakeholder, their interests aligned with the firm. So they might be, because if the stock does well, the employees do even better. They are getting the stock. They are not buying the stock. They are just being given the stock. So that is first. Second is pricing, and third is who will own it. And I said these are easier topics. Well, pricing, I don't think the government should get into pricing at all. Pricing comes if you try to sell the entity to a single buyer, and at what price. I don't think the government should do that. The government is not good at it. The government shouldn't do it, and it will always get accused of pricing it too low and showing favoritism as to whom it sells the unit. The simpler way is to sell equity, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% per week or per quarter, whatever it is, and within 6 months or a year, 30, 40, 50% of equity would be in the hands of investors. The investors will then decide who should be the management. Shareholders, as shareholders, they can decide and elect owners, or not owners, they can elect managers, management. Who owns Bank of America? Who owns Citibank? The biggest owner of these firms is maybe 3 or 4% ownership, and that too is delegated ownership, meaning BlackRock or Fidelity or Vanguard, they own it. There is no reason why ownership that is diffused in the hands of different individuals cannot work in India. It will very well, and the pricing would be transparent. It would be sold at prevailing market prices, and the new shareholders, and if the Tatas or Jhunjhunwala or anyone else wants to buy more of the stock and accumulate that in the open market and get controlling interest, more power to that. We don't have to get into the details. Only thing when it is banking industry, whether there should be a separation between banking owners and industrial owners, that is something the Reserve Bank and the Finance Ministry can make that decision. But barring that, there is really, I think this is pretty straightforward. Both domestic and foreign investors can be welcomed to invest in these. Let me pause here and see how we want to maybe Q&A or have some discussion, whatever, Jayant, you think is appropriate.
Okay, I want to pick up a couple of issues that you raised. And you began by saying that the purpose of privatization is to improve efficiency. And unfortunately, that is not the way it has been seen in India so far. So far, privatization has been seen as a way to augment government revenue. You have a fiscal deficit, and I want to bring the fiscal deficit down by 0.5%, sell off something so that my borrowing, the borrowing requirement comes down by that. And what you're raising is something important, that the purpose of privatization is not to solve the budgetary problem of the government. It may happen, it may be a side effect of that, it may be but you're saying that that should not be the driving principle behind that. And I would like you to elaborate a little bit on this.
Yes. Well, I think it would not benefit the economy in the long run if the sole purpose was to just raise funds. That reminds me of the mythological story of how a hen that was giving the golden eggs, and you want to kill the hen to collect all the golden eggs. And my view of privatization is really keeping the hen alive and collecting golden eggs throughout. And that will happen. One is there's some initial cash flow that the government will get by selling off some equity. Okay, but by giving the equity to employees, mind you, there won't be any cash inflow. It just change in ownership. And the selling of equity in the private sector, that will generate some funds. But the real benefit is going to be when efficiency is improved, there would be more revenues. There would be more revenues, more income, and the tax revenue that the government gets from corporations that are successful, that is the revenue stream that the government will get on an ongoing basis. It will also promote an interest among a large number of people. Many people would be owners, millions of people would be owners, and they would have a stake in the welfare of this public sector, which right now is not evident there. No matter what people say, but it's not evident. I don't think a public sector employee thinks that, gee, other than ensuring a job and pay, is not really that worried about the efficiency or profitability of the firm. Whereas an ownership stake will motivate them more than otherwise. And so, and then regardless, if it is not, we are not worse off. If it is not, how would we be worse off? So that's how I tend to think about it.
Related to that is also this concern that some of these entities are very powerful instrumentalities of the state in multiple ways. So a public sector bank, for example, is an instrument through which the state can directly channel credit where it wants. Okay? Or to take a more live example, the India's, insurance behemoth, which is first on the block. It is for any government, it's an extremely convenient vehicle to do investments in whatever it regards as strategic. So, I often describe public sector financial institutions as the government's, special purpose entity. The debt is not on the government's book. It is not anywhere. It is just a place where you can park whatever you want to do. Now, what do you see as the implication of getting rid of that? If tomorrow the government ends up saying that I don't have these, shell companies or subsidiaries through which I can play things around without bringing anything onto the sovereign balance sheet, you get rid of that. What are the benefits and what are the costs of doing that?
Right. Well, the cost is, of course, that kind of flexibility control might get abused, right? So we are doing two things. One is the government, if it wants to do something and if it controls the channels, then it might be very easy for them to do it, and that is the form of abuse. Okay, and market discipline is what is reduced when you do it. And doing it in a non-transparent fashion also encourages that behavior. So I think keeping it on, making it transparent is less likely to be abused. Second, if you want to do these things, suppose, government channeling some of the credit or something, what is the benefit of channeling that through an inefficient system? Might as well channel it through an efficient system. That's what the US does. That's what many other countries do. It's not like there isn't easy credit offered. That's what you're saying. That in order to provide either by way of safety net or to encourage investment in certain sectors, you want to provide some incentive. And you could do that. That I think the government is not precluded from doing that, even if banks were private. You can, that's what happens in all the developed nations, that the governments do provide. Look at student loans or look at housing finance. All of these things are subsidized for a segment of the society, and that subsidy is channeled through private entities, be it the banks or be it quasi-government entities like the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae in the US. But that is the norm. Student loans are also provided through private entities, but there is subsidized. And so that's what the government can continue. I'm not averse to. The government should have an ability. That's why we elect politicians, to have some public policy. All we are saying is that the same policies can be implemented more efficiently through private sector ownership of these banks.
Yeah, it goes a little beyond credit, So if you take the Life Insurance Corporation, which is presumably going to be the first on the block, during the last 25 years, I can recall several times where the LIC was used to prop up the entire stock market. The stock market is dropping, word goes out from the ministry to the LIC, please go and buy stocks across the board. And that puts a floor on collapsing stock market. Or there have been occasions where it's crazy that you have a privatization thing that is being attempted, not privatization, those days it was divestment, sell a few percentage of the equity, and you're not comfortable with the price that is being offered. And then you ask, the LIC, or maybe you ask another of your public sector companies, please go and buy this. Now, in no sane way of accounting would that be even divestment, forget privatization. But it gives comfort, that, look, a few fat cats cannot fix the price. We have our own people there to counter them, now, is that option in your mind a net good thing or a bad thing? And another way to put it would be, we often talk about the incentive and efficiency value of a hard budget constraint. And one way of thinking about this bloated public sector is that it sort of gets you around that hard budget constraint. You don't even have to go to Parliament and get a spending approved. You can just get the public sector to do that. It is outside the budgetary process. And it gives you, I think if you're in the government, there is a feeling that it gives you a lot of flexibility to act very quickly. And you're giving that up when, of course, I understand the efficiency gain that, yeah, it's better that it be transparent. But I think, a little bit of that.
No, there is no question that what is the clash here is private interest versus public welfare. And the private interest, and when here it is somewhat oxymoronic when I say private interest, here I'm talking about the private interest of the elected politician, right? That they are able to play God in some ways. And they think that they might be doing the right thing, but evidence all over the world would suggest that, well, you should have mechanisms that enable you to resist temptation. Oscar Wilde said, "I can resist everything except temptation." So that's the sense in which here, of course, and what you said earlier was that, well, if the price is too low, we can do some things, make some calls, and then buy something and prop up the price. Isn't that market manipulation? If someone, private entity does that, we put them in jail if the evidence is. But here we are saying, oh, well, this is the right thing to do, government sanction. And so I think we should have less opportunities for this kind of intervention and have more of a market discipline. Markets in India are fiercely competitive. They are fiercely competitive. There is an enormous amount of trading that takes place. And now with wider ownership, if you do privatize and the way I'm suggesting, the chances of manipulation would go even further down. And I think the prices will literally double overnight if there is recognition that there would be private ownership and efficiency gains. So a lot of people will fight over each other to buy these stocks. So the amount of revenue that you will get would be greater, not lower, through this privatization.
Okay, before I take questions from the audience, I would want to, ask you one more question before I open it up. See, in the last, 25, 30 years, we have seen, I think from in India, we have watched privatization happen on a large scale in two countries. One was Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, and the other was Russia after the collapse of communism. And I think most people in India would think that what happened in Russia was, a sort of a disaster, that it produced a bunch of oligarchs, and then you needed an even more repressive state to bring the oligarchs to heel and so on. I don't think many people in India would regard the Russian privatization as a successful one. While I think lots of people would think that what Thatcher did was, they might disagree with it, but definitely it was a far superior outcome to what happened in Russia. So if India is embarking on a privatization of that scale, what kind of processes should we follow? What kind of mechanisms should be designed? Accountability mechanism for the politicians as well, that we do not end up with Russian oligarchs.
Right. That's a great point. I think privatization itself has been attempted in fewer places, as you are saying, but we also have to seek comfort in noting that there are many countries, and they're doing really well with private ownership of all of these types of assets, like financial services or other utilities. So a lot of people in the world have figured that out. This is not rocket science, in other words. So that is point one. I think we should draw confidence from that. Second, I think many problems come when the government gets into pricing things or choosing who to buy. And what I have laid out sidesteps those difficult issues, right? That the government should not be in the business of saying who gets it. I have no axe to grind against Tatas or anybody. But think about Air India being sold to Tatas. It exposed the government to two criticisms. One, was the price right? And two, was there some favoritism in choosing Tatas? Right? And I think there's no need to get into these things. Okay. Now, what happened in Russia, it's a large consequence of law enforcement, their legal system not being that good. And they also tried to, basically the oligarchs they cornered some of those things, those assets, and legally they should not have been able to do that. So I think the only precaution that the government should have is that the process is as transparent and legally enforceable as possible. So the employees can have part of the ownership, and that stock would also be traded so that they are not beholden to owning that security forever. They can enjoy the liquidity if they wish to. And the stock that gets sold to other investors is in open market and in small quantities every week or every month or every quarter, so that the price very quickly reflects what the assessment is. And then maybe the initial 1 or 2% tranche might be sold at a discount or at too high a price because market hasn't settled. But all the subsequent tranches would be sold at what the market believes is the price. And a good set of management will come into play because investors have all the interest in putting in place a management that best shepherds those assets and that company for a successful trajectory.
Okay, so
can I list out a couple of questions?
sure.
So one I think is directed to SP, but others are a little general. First one is talking about is amalgamation of PSU banks a necessary precursor to privatization, number one. Previous, this is I think a little interesting, but little micro. Previous proposals to issue of ESOP to senior and middle management have been shot down by unions due to fear the middle and senior level managers will increase work pressure on junior levels. So what can be possible way to overcome this? This is a practical issue.
Right. No, those are important. First is on amalgamation. I think we should allow mergers and acquisition market to be active. There's no, right now that market is not as active as it should be. So, so if there are 18 banks being privatized, suppose, just for the sake of argument, and they want to merge, and that becomes only 5 banks, so be it. The government has to make sure that there is enough competition in the remaining banks, that M&A does not eliminate that competition. That's the only role of the government, is to make sure that there is not excessive market power. With respect to the point about whether the middle and senior level management will make others work a bit harder, there are 2 things that I want to say. One is that first is all employees should receive ownership, not just the senior or middle management, but all employees. So that is number 1. And the second is that we can grandfather some of the work or employment agreements for the existing employees. So once again, that is the part that is the most difficult part, which is how to overcome the resistance. And I'm saying that it has to be priced out, and priced out 2 ways. One is by giving ownership, some share ownership to employees, and second is by grandfathering some of the employment contracts with the existing employees.
SB, I think the undertone in the first question was, should you do some of this restructuring before you sell, or should you let it happen afterwards? Improvement in efficiency, consolidation, whatever.
I personally think that we should let market decide that. I don't think the government has expertise in deciding these things. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the government, and I was part of the SEC and other places, but I think we need humility, that there is the world out there that it thinks much more creatively, and they do this for a living. Whereas the government doesn't have comparative advantage, the bureaucrats don't have comparative advantage. They have never done that also. So for us to think that, well, we will create this amalgamation and consolidation and then sell those and get a better price, I don't think that is, at all believable, right? And moreover, it is employees, they would have some knowledge. They can decide, because they would be big stakeholders in the new privatized firm, and they can decide what is good for them, rather than we telling you, come here, let me tell you what is good for you. I just don't think that is necessary.
The second one is about, again, the basic principles of efficiency and competition. Since many of the public sector firms do not have competitions, either by size or by government design, what is your take on how to promote competition post-privatization?
Well, I think it is easy to promote privatization. For example, let us take power plants, NTPC. It doesn't have to be that we privatize by having only one entity. There can be 10 entities. Now, of course, electric utilities, they are natural monopolies, and we will need a regulatory apparatus. But take railways. You can easily divide railways into 4 different independent units, or 5 different independent units. That's how it is in the US, that's how it is in Europe, that's how it is in many countries. And they can compete. So you can have some arrangement that they should use common tracks or those things that they should be sharing. But barring that, I think you can easily have multiple railways. So many things you can do by way of privatization, and they don't have to be a single entity privatized without any competition.
Okay, I'll just tell or pick up one, and then you can possibly, Professor Verma, you can move to the next topic. This is SP. I think from an academic angle, there is evidence that going public reduces innovation activities or institutional ownership increases tax avoidance. Then the efficiency might not be obvious, isn't it?
I think that type of evidence that comes in academic research is in a carefully selected setting and at the margin what happens. It misses the big point. I mean, are we saying that all these countries that are advanced nations which have private ownership, they don't have innovation? They don't, I think the big part is that you take all the countries, including countries like Sweden and the Scandinavian nations, which are thought of as, oh, they are much bigger government or socialist countries, so-called. But even there, the ownership is mostly private. What is true is that the government plays a bigger take of funds and it distributes. And even that is only a few percentage points high. But the ownership is largely private, even in those countries. So the thought that innovation and these things suffer is simply not true. It's simply not true. I mean, at the margin, there might be some effect, some 19-20 ka farak, as we say, and that might be. But the first order benefit is going to be enormous by having private sector ownership.
Okay, few questions are there. I think time permits, we will again, get them, but I'll hand it over to Professor Verma.
Okay, so if there is anything more explosive than privatization, it is crypto.
Yes.
So I will basically pose two broad questions to you. One is at the policy level, what kind of regulatory stance should India have towards crypto? We have had proposals, the central bank has been very vocal that nothing less than an outright ban of all cryptos is acceptable to them. And then, of course, you have all shades of gray about, that you have regulation or you want total laissez-faire and so on. So what should the government or the policy makers, how should they look at this space? That's one question. I thought I would just give you both my questions so that you can integrate that. The second, of course, is forget the government. I am Jayant Verma deciding what to do with my savings. Now, where does crypto fit in as an asset class? What is the role of crypto in asset allocation at individual, institutional? You could ask the same question about a big mutual fund and so on. So regulatory issue and asset class issue.
From a policy-making standpoint, I think, it is helpful, in my opinion, to understand the landscape a little bit, okay? That cryptocurrency, well, it's a digital currency, encrypted data sharing, monitored and organized by a peer-to-peer network. So there is decentralization there, at least that is the claim. There's transparency because all these ledger transactions, they are in public domain, really. One can trace those. So there's buying, selling, and transferring. Every digital currency is recorded. There are a number of them. The market is about $3 trillion right now. The total crypto market all over the world is about 3 trillion. There are 1,600 cryptocurrencies or more. So there's an abundance of those. Ownership is highly skewed, but so is for stocks, so is for bonds, but perhaps this is even more skewed than for crypto. That might be because of the novelty and not everybody has jumped on. There's enormous trading that goes on into cryptos. It's just very easy to trade. You can go on Coinbase, you can go on Binance and some other places, and easily they can be traded. Bid-ask spreads are low. These are very liquid securities. Then the question is, why invest in a crypto? And so to some extent, I will touch upon your second question here. The prices are very volatile. Crypto prices are highly volatile. So it's not a cup of tea for everybody, but shouldn't. Far more volatile than equities. The benefit of crypto in a portfolio is that some diversification, because it's highly uncorrelated with the rest. It is somewhat correlated with equity prices, but not that much. So therefore, there might be potential for diversification. But given how volatile it is, I would not put more than a couple percent. I personally have zero in it, but nonetheless, so as 2%, 3%. If you take $3 trillion of the global market, that's where it is, maybe 2% or 3%. So it's in the market portfolio of the world assets. This is not that different. People invested because of some potential for appreciation. Then the part from a regulatory standpoint, it comes is that this is used for illicit purposes, right? And I want to squash that. I think A, the evidence is that it is limited for illicit, and B, the whole premise of these things is that it is transparent. Then that transparency kind of rails against this illicit use argument. And vast majority of the transactions take place on exchanges. So you can always ask, if you trade an equity, the broker dealer would give you at the end of the year what has been your trades, that listing. So you can have for cryptocurrencies also an accounting of what have been the trades. So the other part that I think the central banks rightfully should be worried about is if a cryptocurrency is offered as a fiat currency that will compete with the sovereign fiat currency. Okay. Then, of course, now that we cannot hand over monetary policy to some private yahoos, and they can decide by introducing their own private fiat currency and influence monetary policy. That I think nations would and should disallow that. To the extent that the Reserve Bank of India's opposition to cryptocurrencies is because it will compete as a fiat currency, then I think that is justified. But as far as other reasons, I think people might choose to have crypto as a storage of value. And in which case, my thinking is that so long as it is transparent, which is easily possible, so long as it's not used for illicit purposes, which it can be easily discouraged and monitored and enforced, and so long as it doesn't compete as a currency, fiat currency, then I want to take a slightly less paternalistic attitude. And besides, to some extent, this is like toothpaste. Once it is out, you cannot put back in. We already have $3 trillion of cryptocurrency trading, whether the time to say that, well, we should completely ban it, that was long past, gone. And now we are dealing with $3 trillion of assets, so might as well think about ways in which you can regulate that market and cope with the entity. So that's what I think. Let me very quickly talk about central bank digital currency, and that I think many nations are thinking about introducing central bank digital currency, and that might be the right thing. The advantage of that is that two advantages. Right? People talk about it is more efficient to have central bank digital currency because you can influence monetary supply or contract or expand it literally instantaneously if you have digital currency, and that would be good. Record keeping technology that, it has the benefit of you can have record keeping or accountability of digital currency right to the every second, if not every minute, whereas with physical currency, it's not that easily possible. So that would be good for the digital currency. So I'm all for it. Then there are other claims that people make that it will promote financial inclusion. I think that is an exaggerated claim because the financial inclusion targets those who are unbanked individuals. The unbanked individuals are unbanked because they don't have much income. And we would be, their interest would be better served if there is source of income for them and more employment. That's a much bigger issue, but that is the heart of it. Having a digital currency is not going to include many more people any more than having a physical currency. Finally, is this a death knell for banking industry, digital currency? Because people talk about DeFi and diversified financing and whatever that. I just don't think so. The reason is that the banking survives on credit assessment and credit granting. And those, whether it is digital or physical currency, it doesn't matter. When was the last time that you got a bank mortgage for your home loan or mortgage using physical currency? No, that wasn't an issue. We got $100,000 of bank loan. That is the same as digital currency in many ways. So I don't think that the banking survives on provision of credit, credit evaluation, and those things are not made particularly easier with digital currency. So banking industry will not disappear as a result of digital currency. I hope I addressed the issues, the two questions that you asked, Jen.
Well, in countries like India, as opposed to, let's say, the United States, there is the additional angle of the capital account. We are supposedly, a closed capital account. I say supposedly because I think de facto we have become open capital account, but de jure we are a closed capital account. And there is a bit of concern about what crypto does to the capital account. That does this open up the possibility of things like capital flight? Is that much easier to do using crypto? And also, that's related to another thing that you mentioned about financial inclusion and so on. One of the places where it has actually helped, crypto has actually helped in a few countries, is again on the capital account, that migrant remittances. There are many countries who say that cryptos are much more efficient to remit money, particularly in countries where the domestic banking system is inadequate or something like that. So we have some evidence that when we are talking about cross-border transactions, crypto competes with fiat currencies to a much greater extent than pure domestic economy. So from a capital account point of view, from a capital flight point of view, or what the Reserve Bank always keeps talking about, that this is going to be, dollarization on steroids. The entire Indian economy would be, Bitcoinized. And, of course, you talked about that competition issue, but, for a small economy with attempting to keep at least parts of the capital account closed, what are the concerns that crypto brings in?
There are many things that you have said, and that I'm so rearing to respond to most of those, if not all of those. Okay. First of all, I think the concern that something like Bitcoin would replace a regular currency, I think those are overblown. I mean, look at the volatility. I mean, can you imagine I'm going in a Starbucks and using Bitcoin to pay for my cup of cappuccino or whatever. It's simply not going to happen. Just as it hasn't happened with gold. Gold is also as a store of value. We don't go into Starbucks and say that here are some gold shavings to pay for my coffee. So I just don't think that volatility is going to put a brake on its popularity. It can be used as a store of value. Second, you're absolutely right about the capital flight. And I always have said, and for decades I have been saying that to keep something inside, okay, do you want to imprison or do you want to have openness? But what it does is it disciplines you into thinking about why people would voluntarily stay inside. The role of the government is to say, make rupee so attractive that they would be tempted, US folks would be tempted to become rupeeized as opposed to India becoming dollarized. So the gradually, the more you start thinking about how could we make India an attractive destination so that we don't have to erect walls to retain the funds, I think that is a step in the right direction to think about it, as opposed to resisting that and having the luxury of having this imprisoned capital and saying that, gee, look, I have imprisoned all of them, but you are paying a price for it, right? So I think the right way to think about it is how can we make people voluntarily retain this capital? And the exchange rate is one mechanism that will immediately, discourage that kind of flight of capital. But that should not be the only mechanism. There should be that in general, it should be attractive for people to hold the capital within India, and that is to make India an attractive destination for investment. And the more we think about that, I think the problem will get solved automatically. Now, there might be a ramp that is needed, somewhat gradual. I recognize that we do not want to make this overnight, but there can be a ramp. This other part, all the restrictions, because there is transparency, conversion of these assets into some dollarized assets, that can be reduced or slowed, or taxes, a number of different ways in which you can curb that temptation to a large extent. But using brute force to keep capital inside is not such a great idea, in my opinion. I think it should be more voluntarily, and that requires the government to make itself more attractive. So then there was one more question, which was that remittances, right? And you're absolutely right. I know that remittances right now, if you're doing the traditional way, they cost a fair bit. But to me, it seems that this is having competition of Bitcoin I predict the ultimate effect would be that even when we are doing in rupees, the remittances, the cost will come down. Just as it has already come down quite a bit, and it will come down even faster, and more power to that. So there is nothing magical about if you remit in Bitcoin, the cost would be lower than if it is in rupees. There isn't anything in technology or science or anything that is indicative of that. And there is nothing to stop from banks or others to imitate that technology that Bitcoins would use if we were to remit it in rupees. So I think that this is all for the good. This is the externality of this technology, and this will discipline not just the Bitcoin market, but it will discipline the rupee market also in bringing the cost down and benefiting consumers. So I think we should embrace that.
You talked about central bank digital currency, and I would like to pick your brain on this. To what extent could countries use their own CBDCs as a competitive weapon? that it's very hard. It's very hard for, let's say the Chinese yuan to compete with the rupee in India, right? Because it's simply, there's a lot of barriers to do that. But on the other hand, if you had a Chinese CBDC, could the Chinese CBDC attempt to gain significant market share outside of China, and particularly in India? And I would even want you to think about maybe an outlandish scenario that if China decided to give a wallet to every Indian citizen and preload that with $100 worth of yuan, it'll cost them only $100 billion. And that would give them enormous control of the Indian financial system. If half of India got $100 in their wallets, they're going to use that. And it's the possibility that the Indian rupee gets yuanized. And the cost to them is something that they can easily afford, given the hostile relationships that we have. Could this be a kind of warfare tactic that could be used? CBDTs could become a weapon, could be weaponized?
I don't think so. Because I think what you are saying can easily be done with dollars also, or with yuan also, right? I mean, there is nothing magical about
yuan
the
into
digital.
Everybody's wallet, digital you can. You can't get $100 of yuan notes.
Sure, if you have a bank account, can you not transfer? I mean, I don't think it is that difficult even now. How difficult? Aadhaar, you have been doing it, right? That money is being transferred. What is that so different about, digital currency being put in your wallet versus some money being transferred into your bank account? What is different is that the laws will prevent, right? The laws will say, well, where did you get this $100 or whatever? That's the question. But the same questions can be asked if it is a digital wallet. So I just don't think that is possible. And I always have said this can be viewed as influencing monetary policy by injecting so much. And if you are influencing monetary policy, sovereign nations have the right to control monetary policy in their own nation. And if some foreign entity, just as if private entity, we said, if foreign entity is no different from a private, I mean, it is different, but we can disallow both private entities as well as foreign entities from interfering with the sovereign nation's monetary policy.
Well, I think the question really is, I think we don't have much time to pursue this. You see, if you look at this, that outside of China, which has the Great Firewall, basically you have one Twitter, you have one Facebook, and so on, and the digital world tends to have a winner-take-all characteristic, because the economies of scale are truly global there. And then the question is really that will we have only one digital currency, really?
Yeah, I think people talk about it, but that is same thing is true of dollar. It's historically, and people have claimed, there are so many people who will sing praises and saying that, the dollar being a world currency, that gives a big advantage and all that. And I just don't agree with that. You think about New Zealand. Is New Zealand a good country and does well? Does it have its own currency? I mean, it has its own currency, but does it have a world currency? No. Why does New Zealand, a small country like New Zealand, do well? It does well because they have educated people, they have a governance system that works, they have law enforcement, they have natural resources, there are a number of things that. But we don't think about New Zealand doing well because of, oh my God, they got good financial, monetary policy or good some currency, world currency or this or that. No, none of that. The same thing is true of Sweden. The same thing is true of Norway. The same thing is, these are small countries that are doing really well. So what matters is the real sector. Are people educated or not? Is there law enforcement? Is there a civic sense or not? Is there competition or not? Those are the factors that influence the welfare of an economy. I think fears that all this would be winner take all type of thing, that simply isn't, I'm not too worried about that. I don't think that. And then plus there are plenty of guardrails in the sense that if someone is interfering with your monetary policy, I think that can be precluded.
Okay, so coming back to asset allocation. You talked a little bit about gold, but this is one of the very puzzling things is that during this great, inflation scare that's been going around the world, and people worried about inflation in the US, in Europe, and so on. Gold went nowhere.
Yeah.
Normally, one would expect gold to appreciate a lot in this period. And does that suggest that crypto has already replaced gold as the anti-fiat asset?
Well, maybe I'm not an expert on that. I mean, what I do know is that evidence on gold as an inflation hedge, even if you take the period before crypto, say last 5 years, right? That is what, but if you take the evidence on gold prices prior to that as an inflation hedge, that evidence is weak, if at all.
Yes.
So it's hard to, I think there are certain things in life that we just, so far at least, we don't fully understand. Saying something confidently does have its benefit, and it calms people down. But reality is, if you take a hard look at it, I just don't think we fully appreciate. The second thing about the inflation scare, as we are saying, I think the market and everything, it's not a continuous process. It kind of is almost like in fits and starts. That the long-term trend is clear, that if you keep spending, at some point, it has come back to haunt you. If you are spending beyond your means, at some point, it will come back to haunt you. Now, if it does not in a year or two, we don't want to declare victory that we have conquered the beast. And that's how I kind of, so some basic sensibility has to be there. And you cannot take out more than what you put into the system, that kind of basic common sense. And that's what worries me about some of the consequences. The fact that interest rates are low, notwithstanding inflation being high, that's what people, but the fact that inflation is high and that it is biting people's pocketbook, that is a fact. That is an absolute fact. That and it gets sort of not ratcheted, but at least ingrained into the system is because rents start to rise and they get locked in. Salaries and wages get raises. People are getting much bigger raises in the US than they used to see in the past. So that all of these things have a way of building into that inflation. And only thing that has been late to the party is interest rates. And they have not caught up with this phenomenon. What is the solution? Of course, the solution is on the real side. I mean, apart from raising interest rates in the short run to curtail some of the inflation, the real side is enhance productivity, to unclog some of the supply chain, kind of have better infrastructure so that goods and services can flow more easily. Those are sort of the solution. But we are kind of going away from the main question that you asked.
Yeah. Okay. So before I hand over to Abhiman for questions from the audience, since you raised this, we are onto this low interest rates, and do you worry about, and crypto, there's a lot of worry that crypto is a bubble, and we also see, lot of meme stocks as bubbles, GameStop, and maybe even Tesla looks like a bubble, or negative yielding bonds, long-term bonds look like bubbles. So is this really part of that bubble universe that we have built? Crypto, meme stocks, everything. Is it just the bubble universe that we have built?
Yeah. The trouble with making these predictions is they can be wrong. So, I manage money.
My job is easier. I'm only asking the question.
I have managed a lot of money also in my life. I have done a lot of things, but I just want to show some humility and say that these things are somewhat unpredictable. Not somewhat, they are a lot unpredictable. When Bitcoin was $10,000, I thought it was way overpriced. And then next thing I know, within a matter of a year or two, it was at $60,000. So I would have lost my shirt if I had shorted Bitcoin at that point. Right? I would not be sitting here at all. I would be bankrupt and foraging for food somewhere. So I don't know, but some of these things do seem bubbly. There's no question that some of these things seem so frothy. But on the other hand, it is the case that there are a few stocks that account for a lot of the valuation and appreciation. And you look at, in the US, 5 stocks account for about $10 trillion. Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and Google. Those account for $10 trillion. That is a substantial part of the total equity market. And if you look at how much income they are generating and how on our day-to-day lives, whether it is iPhone or Amazon's services or Facebook that we use, all of those things, those are not bubbles, those are real. Those are very real. And the amount of stock buyback that they do. So I somehow think that the market might not be getting it totally wrong. That chances are that we are maybe surmising that they are getting it totally wrong.
So Abhiman.
Yes, maybe a couple of questions. We are running a little late. So the first one is actually supporting what SP is talking, but she wants to take your views on what kind of regulatory mechanism we introduce to reduce volatility in crypto.
Yeah, I think Bitcoin and some of those currencies, the supply is kind of held back, and therefore prices have been high and also volatile. But I don't want to. I like, generally speaking, a light touch approach to regulation. I don't want to be giving the power to regulators to reduce the volatility of Bitcoin. I think that is a form of market manipulation, and I don't want. So unless we have a diagnosis that some market players are contributing to the volatility, then of course we should have enforcement, discipline those individuals, both privately and through regulators. But otherwise, we have to let some of these things play out a little more. So less paternalistic approach to regulation is what I tend to think of.
Okay, another question is asking about your comments on the recent cross-border payment projects triggered by the Bank for International Settlements. Example, CBDC-based transfers are striking at the heart of corresponding banking system while claiming to reduce associated liquidity risk.
Well, this is a typical those who are existing players and making a lot of money. When competition or new technology hurts them, they start making claims that of various nature. So while I want to be empathetic to them, I mean, nobody wants to see anybody being hurt. At the same time, we don't want to be coming in the way of technological advancement and therefore productivity improvement or efficiency gains. And we want to take care of those who are hurt, provide some safety net, and be supportive and be empathetic. But at the same time, consumers are going to be served only if we do embrace these technological changes as well as efficiency improvements. The classic example, of course, we all know, and it's almost like a cliche, when buggy whips were replaced by automobiles, and automobiles would be replaced with electric cars. I mean, they are also automobiles, but technology would be changing. So these are gut-wrenching to those who are adversely affected by them, and we want to be empathetic, we want to be sympathetic to them. And the hallmark of a good society, of a just society, is to support, to help, to uplift some of those who are affected, but not to stand in the way of progress.
Okay, the last question I just want to pose before both of you, and either of you can pick this. This is I think typically India specific question. You know, it's a kind of complaint. India is a home to many path-breaking digital payment innovations, but not all stakeholders are happy with the regulatory mandates. They say constant policy changes and the strict deadlines to comply with them do not favor any player by design, but seems to help NPCI products such as RuPay and UPI. Will policy tweaks make cash rule again? This is again typically a problem I think our guys are facing. If you have any comment on this.
I think this is a problem that Jayant has created. No, I think this is again incumbents being, and the regulatory bodies favoring. Look, I mean, regulatory bodies generally have like investor protection and fair markets and capital formation. Those three tend to be the main objectives. And I think they take investor protection so seriously, and they start thinking that everybody is their children and they are to be protected. And we forget that competition and markets inherently, open markets and fair markets inherently protect investors. And embracing that, it almost implies that, well, what's the role for regulators then, right? And therefore they think that, oh my God, we are the ones who are protecting investors. And it's a mind change that has to come, and it takes time, and we have to be sympathetic to that. But the real protector of investors is our competition and good law enforcement, because there might be some rogue players that need to be disciplined either privately or by regulators. So our mindset has to graduate toward the belief that competition and free markets will protect investors, but there's a role for safety net, there's a role for enforcement, and that is the combination that we want to use.
Okay, over to you, Jia.
Okay, so that brings us to the last topic of today's discussion, which is about SPACs. Nobody had heard this acronym a couple of years ago, but today in India also there is a lot of interest in this, because there have been rumors for quite some time now that one of India's most valuable tech companies is likely to go public using a SPAC. People have been talking about how Byju's is planning to use SPACs to go public, and therefore there's a lot of interest in this. So, what are your thoughts on this? And basically, two questions really. One is to look at SPAC as part of this whole bubbly, frothy universe that we talked about. The other way of looking at it is that for many of today's tech companies, traditional accounting measures are inadequate to capture their state of affairs. And in some ways, the IPO regime is broken for some of these companies, and therefore we have created SPAC as a workaround. So how would you, there's the two opposite views of this. So,
on the last part, before I forget, I want to just say, it's much like we said remittances. They are too costly domestically, and digital remittances would make it introduce competition. And I said that would discipline even the conventional remittance, that process. So I have a similar reaction. If SPACs become the alternative, then people will quickly realize, gee, the IPO process, unless the regulation prevent them, that IPO process should become more efficient rather than their lunch being eaten by SPACs, right? So that is the whole benefit of disciplining or competition and new technology, that existing players also adapt to a certain extent so that they can survive. I think SPACs are much misunderstood and therefore maligned. Okay, so let us very quickly, I will give you a rundown on what a SPAC is. Okay, a SPAC, a sponsor comes along and raises some money in a blank check IPO. Okay, so a sponsor might put in, say, $5 million and raise $100 million in an IPO. Okay, sponsors, they spend few $1 million. Okay, they have to spend that. That comes out of their own pockets. Then they have 2 years, up to 2 years, for the IPO money to be used to acquire a target with the approval of shareholders. Okay. Investors in that SPAC IPO, initial IPO, okay, they can have that entire 2-year period to redeem their shares and get their cash back. So there is no downside risk to an investor. If you don't like it at any point in time, you can redeem. If suppose you have put in 1 lakh rupees to buy some IPO shares of a SPAC, you don't like it, 2 years later, up to 2 years later, you can withdraw that, you can get that redeemed with interest. With interest. So that is the protection that every IPO shareholder has. What is the evidence? Most retail investors redeem. So they buy those shares. If it doesn't go up in price much, they redeem it. And the reality is vast majority of them redeem. Sponsors acquire a target within those 2 years with whosoever the remaining investors are after the redemption. And they bring in additional investors, institutional investors. These are called pipes. Okay. And if they don't succeed, if the sponsor does not succeed in having a target acquired within 2 years, then they fold. They return the money to the remaining shareholders. They lose their entire investment. The initial few $1 million that they have put in, they lose their entire. How often does that happen? 15% of the time. So 15% of the time, the sponsors get zero. They lose their entire investment, minus 100% return. Okay. Now, SPACs, as you said, Jan, they are an alternative route to accessing public markets for private companies. That is the targets, right? Targets benefit from sponsors' knowledge of markets and industry. So these sponsors are not some random people, but generally speaking, they have certain expertise, their knowledge about markets, and so the target benefits from that. So let us look at who are the stakeholders, okay? First is retail investors. And I explained that they don't face any downside. Then there are targets. The targets, they, like in any merger situation, they seem to get overpaid because post-merger performance is slight to large negative, meaning thereby the targets get overpaid. So that is the same as mergers without SPACs. Okay. Then there are institutional investors, which is what the most of the investors in this are. They include wealthy individuals and hedge funds also. Those are all those I will call them as institutional, or some people prefer the term sophisticated investors. They don't seem that sophisticated, but let us go with that. Okay. They constitute the bulk of SPAC investors. I think it is silly to think that they get fooled. One of the criticisms of SPACs is that the sponsors make unseemly optimistic projections and investors are getting fooled. But as I said, small investors, A, most of them don't put in money, and B, they have downside protection for up to 2 years. C, most of the investors are institutional investors. To think that they are getting fooled by these projections, well, let them get fooled then. If they are not sophisticated, it seems, if they had, but it seems highly unlikely that they would be getting fooled. In any case, there are private litigation or regulatory mechanisms to discipline or hold these individuals accountable for making wild, optimistic projections. So that is, then there are the sponsors, that is the other stakeholders. So I went through, retail investors, targets, institutional investors, and then sponsors. The sponsors, as I said, they put in some money up front and they risk losing that entire amount, and that happens in 15% of the cases. In other cases, they receive some generous compensation. Whether it is too generous or not, let the markets decide. And if there is some evidence to suggest that it is too generous, one can discipline that. But there is plenty of competition among SPAC sponsors. So that thing has already come down. It will come down even more. Overall, I don't see much economic rationale for choking off this market. I think it should compete with the regular IPO market and let the chips fall where they may.
You of course compared SPACs with mergers and said the targets get overpaid, and that's like in any other merger. But the other comparison is with an IPO, where most IPOs leave money on the table, right? So is a SPAC a more efficient way of going public?
Sorry to interrupt, but actually that is not true. If you look at the performance of IPOs 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, that is negative as well. And so are the SPACs. Maybe SPACs are a little more negative, but these are time period effects. And here, what I'm saying is, and then even in the IPOs, I think there is a little bit of that lottery phenomenon even in an IPO. Those who put money in Google or Facebook or Microsoft, ask them what is the performance of an IPO, and they will say, "My God, you hit a jackpot, you hit a lottery." Right? Whereas you ask 100 other IPOs, and they will say, "We lost our shirt." So SPACs are also a little bit like that. There are few SPACs that do extraordinarily well. Many SPACs don't do well, just as in IPO. Some IPOs do extraordinarily well. Many IPOs don't do that well.
But isn't there a sectoral kind of bias in SPACs? You don't find old economy companies using SPACs, right? It always tends to be some kind of tech or intangible kind of thing, right? So is there something there that it is doing a better job for them?
Even IPOs are more on tech. So that's where it's like that's where action is. Those are the ones that want to go IPO. And so SPACs, yeah, and it could be that they are even a little more skewed, but that might very well be the case. But I think many conventional firms are also going through SPAC. And does it go through cycles? Yes, it does. Was there a fad for a while for SPACs? Yes, there was. Has that cooled down? Yes, that has cooled down. And that's what you expect. Rationality is a kind of strange thing when there is a lot of momentum chasing that goes on. To me, that is counter to rationality, but that's how the world is. But that doesn't mean that, who am I to judge what others should be doing, institutional investors or hedge fund investors, what they should be doing. So long as there isn't any manipulation of market, so long as there isn't any fraud that is taking place, I tend to say that, well, let adults play the game that they want to play. If there are risks, well, they should be stated. And if the regulators want to announce those risks with a megaphone, by all means, do that. But why preclude players from engaging in these activities?
Okay, I think we have already overshot our time a bit. But Abhiman, if there are some questions, we can probably...
I do not see any questions on SPACs.
Okay.
So I think earlier, most of the questions we have answered, but I think a couple of questions on privatizations. Primarily they're asking about if there is a change in a government, then and they change the policy subsequently, how do you deal such policies? Okay. So if you want, any of you want to reflect on that, I can.
People elect governments, and if they change policies, that happens. That's part of life. And the economies, if there is too many changes, and economies suffer because policy uncertainty is one of the risks that gets priced, and that is. And hopefully, people in choosing governments or choosing administrations, as well as administrations choosing policies, one hopes that they take into account this extra cost that they would be imposing as a result of being too trigger happy with changes in policies. So that's what ultimately that is the discipline that we hope, but it's also the responsibility of the voters to choose administrations to support policies that inject a dose of stability rather than inject uncertainty in policies.
Yeah, and I think part of the solution is also your proposal that you're not selling it to a strategic buyer, but you are doing a very broad-based thing. And it's difficult for a new government to pick up a fight with 1 million shareholders.
Exactly.
It's a lot easier to pick up a fight with one oligarch and send him to jail. You can do that, but you can't send 1 million retail investors to jail. So you can't even probably rob them of their assets. There is power in that way of privatization. Anything else, Abhiman, before we close?
I think we have covered most of the questions, and I'm done with the questions. Yes.
Okay.
So maybe on behalf of IIMA, I would like to thank both of you for taking time out and talk on topics which are of immediate relevance for many of us. Thank you very much, SP. Thank you very much, Professor Jia Verma. And particularly for SP, if you visit next time to IIMA, possibly you will find a lot of changes. There are many construction activities happening around, and a lot of new buildings have come up. So you may not find your old IIMA maybe, or you will find, of course, but a little different. So we invite you whenever you are in India, just give us some time. It's your home. So anytime we'll be welcoming you here. Thank you very much. It's already 9:05. We are 20 minutes past our schedule. And that's it. And from the center, for many purposes, we'll reach out to you for your advice, for your guidance. We'll actually try to get you involved in some of our work, what we do. Hopefully, we'll be getting your consent on that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity, and it is so wonderful to be part of this conversation for my alma mater. And Jayant, it is an extra dose of pleasure and delight to be talking to you. You are insightful, feisty, and controversial as ever, and I admire every bit of it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
Thank
been
you.
a great day. Thank you.